Without further ado, allow me to introduce our next speaker, Ross Channing Reed. Ross has been a philosophical counselor in private practice since 1998, and Ross has been a member of APA. I think, Ross, right from day one, you've been with us pretty much, and yes, a member since our inception, and it's great always to see you again. Ross is the author of a number of books, Love and Death, An Existential Theory of Addiction, The Liberating Art of Philosophy, Mindscapes, Precarity, Trauma, Addiction, and Love Forthcoming. Other works of philosophy and fiction, as well as a number of book chapters and scholarly articles. He's a member of the National Philosophical Counseling Association, is certified in client counseling by the APPA, and he teaches philosophy at Missouri University of Science and Technology. And the title of his talk today is Existential Philosophical Counseling, Part 1. Ross, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lou. Thank you to everyone. I've really enjoyed listening to the presentations today. And yes, I have made the mistake of starting to do philosophical counseling even before the APP existed. And that's what I want to talk about today. Based on Hamad's example, I'm going to try to actually share my paper. And I haven't done that before, but if I can, I'm going to.
You're a co-host, so you can share the screen with us.
Can I? Okay, so I can.
So you load your paper up so you can see it in your browser. Then
and then okay, I think I got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can share screen.
Yep, you can. And there it is. Very large. There we go.
I'll make it a little smaller if I can.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good, Ross.
Okay.
Now you've cut it off. There you go.
Okay. Everybody see it?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I think the crisis of meaning is universal now, and I really appreciate what Mustafa said regarding that. So what I would like to do today is talk about kind of my experiences as a philosophical counselor, and also talk about my experiences as a recipient of mental health services, and also my experience of working in mental health, which I did in graduate school, and how those combined to come up with a couple of specific observations. So the title, Existential Philosophical Counseling, Clinical Observations, Part 1, and this is much longer, so I just made it short for today, but I'm going to focus on circumscribed self-disclosure, moral discourse, and moral presence. And I'm going to skip to those specific topics. And I have a couple of examples also. Okay. Okay. Principles and practices of existential philosophical counseling, clinical observations. What I have learned from my work in mental health as a recipient of mental health services and as an existential philosophical counselor. And that's my term. The importance of active listening and circumscribed self-disclosure. While in graduate school in philosophy, between 1983 and 1994, I worked off and on in a psychiatric hospital for children and later in a residential facility for mentally ill adults. These experiences were invaluable in shaping, in part, my approach to philosophical counseling. Based on these limited personal experiences, I would like to make a few general observations. Early on, I noticed that staff interactions with patients were designedly therapeutic. In practice, this meant that staff rarely expressed their real thoughts or feelings to patients. This was generally the case as a matter of policy, but there were some truly notable exceptions. The underlying philosophical assumptions for this policy did not seem open for debate. Patients often remained lonely, isolated in clinical settings that were meant to bring them relief. Staff were discouraged from probing into a patient's past. Real trauma remained unacknowledged. The tacit denial of the right to become aware of, uncover, and speak one's story served to compound that trauma. My work in residential and inpatient mental health constitutes one existential aspect of my training as a philosophical counselor, an aspect I have found to be invaluable. As a result, I find that non-programmatic, active listening, in conjunction with limited expression of my thoughts and feelings, when judged to be in the client's best interest, is essential to the philosophical counseling relationship. In all other cases, the ideal would be the elimination of such expression. This is the principle of circumscribed self-disclosure. Here's a pertinent example of not following this guideline taken from my experience as a recipient of mental health services. Years ago, I contacted a clinical psychologist for help. The psychologist was working with me for a short while when I made the decision to seek help elsewhere as soon as I realized that I was listening to her complain to me about her office staff. This may be a rather extreme example, but the point I'm trying to drive home is that as a philosophical counselor, I should express my thoughts and feelings only in the limited context of what I've carefully judged to be in the best interest of my client. Something we can get wrong, obviously. I've gotten it wrong many times. Venting, self-expression, showing what you know, knee-jerk reactions, etc., must be strictly off the table. I reiterate this point because the psychologist I mentioned had over 30 years of clinical experience and had developed the habit of talking about herself as a matter of course during therapy sessions. She had even complained to me about her father during our sessions. This example, unfortunately, is not an isolated case. As philosophical counselors, we need to be able to adhere to the principle of circumscribed self-disclosure, and if we cannot, it seems pointless to move to a discussion of other aspects of philosophical practice. An example of appropriate circumscribed self-disclosure is the following. I was in therapy with a clinical psychologist in Chicago in the early 90s, and we were discussing parental competition with and envy of their children. This is not a thing I had given a lot of thought to at the time. He provided me with an example that was so good, it has stuck with me to this day. He looked at me and said, "Playing the piano is something I've always wanted to do. I expressed this to my mother when I was in elementary school, and she said, 'No, you don't need a piano. I never had one.'" There are so many things wrong with the logic in his mother's insensitive response that I won't even begin to dismantle it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this psychologist was exhibiting appropriate, circumscribed, and insightful self-disclosure. He helped me immensely during the year we worked together. This is an important model for philosophical counselors. It takes practice and reflection to discern the Aristotelian mean between the extremes of over-disclosure and under-disclosure. In this sense, the practice of existential philosophical counseling requires the development of the intellectual and moral virtues requisite for appropriate self-disclosure. This takes a very specific and developed self-presence. At the same time, we must be present to the client so that we can understand and empathize with them to the degree that we are capable. This double awareness is something that must be developed, much like an Aristotelian virtue, and requires interoceptive awareness, the sense of knowing what is happening with your body, reflective and affective self-awareness, as well as empathic awareness, both cognitive and affective, of the other. Now I'd like to talk about the importance of moral discourse and moral presence. Emmanuel Levinas and Simone Weil. Appropriate circumscribed self-disclosure requires not only the ability to articulate moral arguments, but the ability to interact with the client as one moral being to another. Emmanuel Levinas, for example, holds the face to signal the indefeasible, implacable moral call of the other. In the face of the other, we recognize mortality, fallibility, precariousness, solitude, and pain. Levinas writes in Alterity and Transcendence that, quote, "But that face facing me, in its expression, in its mortality, summons me, demands me, requires me, as if the invisible death faced by the face of the other unknown by the other whom already, in the nakedness of his face, it concerns, it regarded me before its confrontation with me, before being the death that stares me myself in the face. The death of the other man puts me on the spot, calls me into question, as if I, by my possible indifference, became an accomplice to that death, as if before being condemned to it myself, I had to answer for that death of the other, and not leave the other alone to his deathly solitude. Unquote. Appropriate circumscribed self-disclosure indicates to the client that they are not alone. Such disclosure is a bridge from solitude to the recognition of our common humanity. Even if the counselor does not and cannot have an answer to what appears to be meaningless and intractable suffering, to be with the client in this way can alleviate suffering. French philosopher Simone Weil composed The Need for Roots, prelude to a declaration of duties toward mankind, in 1943, 5 years prior to the United Nations ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In this work, Weil forcefully argues that we have an obligation towards every human being, quote, for the sole reason that he or she is a human being, without any other condition requiring to be fulfilled, and even without any recognition of such obligation on the part of the individual concerned. Like Kant and Levinas, Weil posits this obligation as unconditional. She writes that, quote, there are forms of cruelty which can injure a man's life without injuring his body. An astute commentary on the nihilism of the techno-precarious performance society. If our basic physical and moral needs are not met, Weil argues, quote, we fall little by little into a state more or less resembling death, more or less akin to a purely vegetative existence. Given universal basic moral needs, both moral discourse and moral presence are required of the philosophical counselor. Neither can be assumed. Moral presence is an existential condition that has, in many respects, been ceded to what Russian anthropologist Alexei Yurchak and British filmmaker Adam Curtis call hypernormalization. Hypernormalization is a situation in which we know that existing systems no longer function, but, quote, we don't have any vision of an alternative. In a hypernormalized society, a constructed, cybernetic, fake world effectively replaces any sense of living in community with others. When all the levers of a functioning society have been replaced by their simulacra, and we cannot even imagine a way out, only pretense and subterfuge remain. The result is the society of the spectacle described by Guy Debord, a society in which humanity is no longer able to take its own needs seriously. To go further, a society in which we are all systemically disabled from taking our own needs seriously. This is the society described in Neil Vallely's Futilitarianism, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. Levinas and Weil are correct. We all suffer when we live in a society that fails to recognize the existence of both physiological and moral needs. Quote, the great event of this period, the great trauma, is this decline of strong referentials, these death pangs of the real and of the rational that open onto an age of simulation, writes Jean Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation. Simulation is required in a society which has foreclosed the possibility of meeting both physiological and moral needs. Facts and reason languish behind the veil of spectacle, illusion, misinformation, and false consciousness. Moral presence can no longer be presumed in a world in which presence itself exists under erasure. Moral presence is a necessary, but not necessarily sufficient condition, given that clients usually arrive with specific issues in mind. At times, the mutual recognition that there is no clear-cut answer can bring great relief by highlighting and underscoring the difficulty of the situation rather than any real or imagined limitations of the counselee. The inability to discern an answer may be a function of structurally induced conditions that are, in fact, insurmountable through individual ingenuity or volition. In a recent email to me, a client reflected on the terrible cognitive dissonance and confusion he had been feeling, and his implacable sense of having no future, his sense of powerlessness, anomie, and dread. He ends the email by asking, "Are we actually circling the drain? Is this the end?" For example, in the United States, where healthcare is not a right but a commodity, a situation now becoming global as austerity measures continue unabated, there are literally millions of individuals each year who require specific healthcare but are unable to afford such healthcare, even if they have health insurance. They may try to pay for the healthcare they need and end up with enormous medical debt and all the fallout associated with this, in addition to having to deal with the issues surrounding their health condition. Frequently, a combined weight of suffering from health issues and medical debt is so significant that it causes other health issues, driving them further into sickness, debt, and despair. These intractable systemic issues cannot be surmounted by individual actors and are insoluble within a market-driven system. Even if the philosophical counselor does not and cannot have an answer to such logistical conundrums, to be with the client in mutual recognition can alleviate suffering. We can acknowledge the disconnect between the inherent value of human life and the moral bankruptcy of a system that fails to recognize such value. The experience of being treated with dignity and respect is itself therapeutic, whereas it almost goes without saying that the quotidian manipulation, exploitation, precaritization, and commodification inherent in a morally bankrupt system creates stress, confusion, myriad health issues, anxiety, and depression. Here's an example of the disconnect between the inherent value of human life and the moral bankruptcy of a system that fails to recognize such value. Not long ago, a client of mine, we'll call her Barbara, emailed me to make an appointment as soon as possible. The situation was simple. Barbara had gone to the dentist and was reclining in the dentist chair, waiting for the dentist, when someone came back to tell her that her insurance had been declined. Knowing she couldn't pay the bill, she began to hyperventilate as her pulse and blood pressure went through the roof. She slowly got out of the chair, shakily got her coat, and walked out. She sat in her car on the verge of a panic attack. Finally, she was able to drive home, but she couldn't focus because of the black cloud. All the thoughts and feelings of worthlessness that she'd been dealing with all her life came flooding back. The old feelings of not being good enough, of having something wrong with her, of being a bad person, of having no right to exist. In short, Barbara was sure it was her, that she had done something wrong, that she deserved what she had gotten. Now imagine if you or someone you care about had been in Barbara's situation. I imagine it as she described it, and the more she spoke, the angrier I got. She's telling me the story. She's on her back, lying in a chair, in a vulnerable position, thinking she's in a safe place, and she's ambushed from behind. The situation was embarrassing, humiliating, dehumanizing, and cruel. A very conscientious person, Barbara had even called her insurance provider before she had gone to the appointment, knowing the needed care exceeded her ability to pay, and had gotten confirmation that the procedure would be covered, since if it wasn't, payment would have to be made at the time of service. She had taken off work to go to the appointment, and in the end, she did not get the procedure she needed. She had instead been humiliated, disrespected, and treated like an errant child. She had had to walk out, trembling and in shock, thinking she had done something wrong. I told her how angry the situation made me feel, how I thought it had been a setup, and that it would have made anyone feel bad. That setup had catapulted her back into that familiar black cloud where she had lived for most of her life, thinking that somehow, like a dark magnet, she was attracting the deserved mistreatment. When she saw me express my thoughts and feelings, Barbara began to relax. Her breathing, pulse, and blood pressure soon returned to normal. She didn't feel anger at the time because she was trained not to feel it. But she did feel relief, and she was able to realize that the setup was a direct consequence of a morally bankrupt system, not something she'd done or failed to do, that it wasn't really about her at all. Her ability to make this paradigm shift alleviated a great deal of her suffering, almost all of it associated with self-blame and shame. At one point, she even laughed out loud, a laugh of solidarity, as if to say, hey, I wasn't being singled out. We're all being screwed, at least almost all of us. In abstracting herself from the scene and perceiving the event systemically, she was able to let herself off the hook. Through my circumscribed self-disclosure, Barbara and I were able to build a shared cognitive and affective solidarity. To reiterate, the experience of being treated with dignity and respect is itself therapeutic, whereas it almost goes without saying that the quotidian manipulation, exploitation, precaritization, and commodification inherent in a morally bankrupt system creates stress, confusion, myriad health issues, anxiety, and depression. In addition to the therapeutic, human, and humane importance of treating clients with dignity and respect, philosophical counselors are able to utilize philosophical concepts to help clients reframe their situations so that they can learn to minimize the toxic shock of having to live in a morally bankrupt system. The tools used in this example include the principle of circumscribed self-disclosure, moral disclosure and moral presence, and systemic philosophical analysis. Sadly, we live in a world where the basic preconditions for truly human moral interaction are increasingly rare, and yet they are something we cannot live without. We remember the words of Levinas, but that face facing me, in its expression, in its mortality, summons me, demands me, requires me, calls me into question. We are overwhelmed by transactional relationships in daily life. The last thing we want to do is reduce the philosophical counseling relationship to some kind of formula, ritual, transaction, and fail to see the unique person right before our eyes. Many times, our own insecurities and anxieties blind us to the other. We are too busy thinking about the next thing to actually be present in the now. Ironically, we might even be so busy trying to find a cognitive, rational solution to a client's problem that we aren't fully present to that client. At times, not providing an answer might be the most respectful course of action. Maybe we don't have an answer, or our answer isn't the right one for our client. But our insecurity and anxiety may drive us to attempt to provide answers, even if providing them may not be in the best interest of the person sitting before us. Sometimes people don't really want an answer. They want human connection. Solving their stated problem might jeopardize the possibility of an ongoing relationship. They might prefer the connection to any answer we could provide. Or their stated problem may have nothing to do with why they've sought help in the first place. They may know that, or they may not. The client might want to formulate their own solutions in your presence, with you as a witness to their ability to do precisely this. If not done in a timely and respectful manner, solving their problem for them could, paradoxically, undermine trust. And without trust, it doesn't really matter how good you might be at solving the client's problem. Let's look at the American Philosophical Practitioners Association Code of Ethics, Part 2, Standards of Ethical Practice, Section 2 in part. And this isn't the whole thing, but philosophical practitioners should facilitate maximum client participation in philosophical explorations. They should avoid dictating, quote, correct answers to client queries and issues, but should actively encourage the client's own engagement of reflective powers and rational determinations. In Part 2, Section 1, in providing professional services, the philosophical practitioner should maintain utmost respect for client welfare, integrity, dignity, and autonomy. Living in a society where deflection, multitasking, flight, superficiality, memes, tropes, ghosting, lack of sustained attention, and absence have become normalized, learning to be present is nothing less than a revolutionary task. Ghosting, for example, signifies the quintessential inability to engage or commit, characteristic of the non-substantive postmodern self, a self rife with so much freedom and opportunity that in its very ubiquity cannot be present at all. Everywhere turns out finally to be nowhere at all. What can it mean that for so many of us, wherever we are, we want to be somewhere else, or that we are in fact somewhere else? How else to explain texting and driving? Even the threat of death apparently pales in comparison to the insufferability of having to be in one place at a time, and this even while moving rapidly through space in a cage of glass and steel. How else to explain the modern debacle of online dating, where a surfeit of options often leads to suboptimal choice or no choice at all? The endless vetting, background checks, scrutinization of the ad copy that passes for a dating profile, and the latest addiction, not dating, but instead scrolling for hours on dating apps, analyzing, swiping left, right, messaging, ghosting, and never meeting at all. Or meeting in a transactional way, going through the motions, and all the while feeling as if the whole thing is somehow surreal, which is the case, given that no one's really there. It's ghosting while showing up. Corporeal ghosting, that is, just another dimension of the preternatural absence of the postmodern self. Not to worry, there are literally thousands of options to choose from right there on your phone. You can transcend the need to be anywhere by envisaging your options that run to infinity. If all else fails, you can fall in love with an AI chatbot that won't let you down, unless you can't pay your bill or there's a power outage. Humans, it turns out, are so 20th century. In the age of abstinence and overstimulation, it tracks that anxiety-laced loneliness would appear as the scourge of our time. And I'd like to end with this short section on Kierkegaard and anxiety in The Philosophical Counselor. Kierkegaard and the Pedagogy of Anxiety. Like any revolutionary action, being present to the client involves a certain level of risk and potential discomfort, possible anxiety, and fear. These feelings might be interpreted by the philosophical counselor as some kind of personal deficiency, when in fact they may signal the return of a deeper level of presence to self. To be effective philosophical counselors, we may need to feel anxiety. This is the pedagogical truth of anxiety so eloquently described by Kierkegaard in his 1844 work, The Concept of Anxiety. Following this thread of anxiety can teach us deeper truths about ourselves, but we are often blocked by what Kierkegaard describes as an antipathetic sympathy and a sympathetic antipathy, essentially ambivalence producing a freeze response. This freeze response could be cognitive, affective, physiological, volitional, or a combination of these. We want real connection, but at the same time we flee from it. Quote, anxiety is neither a category of necessity nor a category of freedom. It is entangled freedom, where freedom is not free in itself, but entangled. Not by necessity, but in itself. Writes Kierkegaard. Anxiety, tells us, is the dizziness of freedom. Is it any wonder that various forms of subterfuge comprise a large fraction of human history, or that we lie to ourselves in a valiant attempt to escape from this dizziness? This is nothing less than the bad faith described by Sartre in Being and Nothingness, the lie told within the unity of a single consciousness. Unlike the Freudian model, Sartre's existential psychoanalysis denies the existence of an unconscious. We always know on some level that we are lying. Whether this is true is a subject for another discussion, but it certainly seems true that we are aware of a significant percentage of the lies we tell ourselves, given the lengths to which we go in order not to be aware of them. The dizziness described by Kierkegaard is in fact a kind of vertigo, which Kierkegaard describes in the following way. Anxiety may be compared to dizziness. He whose eye happens to look down into the yawning abyss becomes dizzy. But what is the reason for this? It is just as much in his own eye as in the abyss, for suppose he had not looked down. As philosophical counselors, we are constantly challenged to look down. In this sense, we must deal with anxiety and dizziness in choosing to be present to the other. In the monumental privilege of working with the other, we feel anxiety when we are, at least to some degree, aware in real time of the extent of our freedom, our limitations, and the possibility of our own fallibility. These are simply a few initial clinical observations of an existential philosophical counselor who has worked in various mental health settings and in private practice over a period of more than 40 years. These observations constitute part one of a series on existential philosophical counseling. Subsequent papers will expand upon these observations and discuss the conceptual contributions of existential thinkers from antiquity to the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. A very rich presentation. Okay, Kevin, you were cut off last time for want of time, and now we'll give you the floor since your hand is up. So please unmute and go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross, for such an interesting presentation. I think this was mostly going to be an observation, but I'll turn it into a question. So something that I think that was at the center of your paper was the idea that the recognition of dignity is central to the therapeutic benefit that can occur in a counseling situation. Yeah. And so there was something interesting that I kind of found that happened at the beginning of this meeting today and in your paper. We began this meeting today. I don't remember how we got onto it, but we talked about AI a little bit, and Lou was giving some statistics on students cheating through the development over the last couple of years. And then there was mention about AI replacing people, right? And then replacing counselors. And Lou had said, well, maybe not, we can hope, maybe not philosophical counselors. And now this leaves me to think what your paper brought up for me is maybe this is the core. If so much of the therapeutic benefit comes from a recognition of dignity, perhaps a mutual one between the counselor and a counselee, maybe we can be hopeful that AI will never be able to do that. But what do you think? To turn it into the question, do you have any thoughts on that?
I love your question, Kevin. Well, I guess the short answer would be only a moral being can accord dignity to another moral being. And AI is not a moral being. That's my short answer.
Asked and answered. Excellent. Excellent question. Excellent answer. We have more hands up. Patricia, I saw your hand first, and then Rick. Okay, Patricia, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Ross. Fantastic presentation. Really, I enjoy listening to you. Point you touch and all the development of your organization find really a full resonance in my practice and in my thought. And I really appreciate the quotation of Simone Weil, which I consider a great author. And as Camus defined her when she died, the only great spirit of our time. So Simone Weil is absolutely fundamental in your vision. And I always suggest to read to those colleagues who don't know the author, to read Gravity and Grace, which is a great text. And also a beautiful text written by an old friend of mine, who is David McClellan from the University of Canterbury, 87 years old. Beautiful, beautiful book called Utopian Pessimist, The Life and Thought of Simone Weil. And the problem that Kevin Cales was touching just before me, the value of mutual recognition and the physical and moral presence of the two people, the face-to-face encounter, really are central. So, yes, AI is not moral and is not human, and that's it. So, nothing to say more. Yes. So, thank you a lot.
Thank you. No, I do think, your question and Kevin's question, I mean, could AI replace us? And I think the answer is yes and no. It could replace us because people, they eat junk food. A lot of things thing. Almost everything is a fake now. So of course people would accept something that's fake, but they know ultimately that's not going to be satisfying. It's just the best they can get. So they just go for, what Mill would say would be the low-hanging fruit in terms of pleasures.
Yeah.
It's really all they're going to get, so they'll take it.
More work for us. More work for us. Our role can be that one of opposing and making recognition our value compared. But yes, AI is it's a useful tool, but that's it. That's it. Useful tool, very useful tool. Can help us, but not substituting us. Yes. No moral question or ethical answers. So yes, and no physical presence. That's the main point. So really, in my practice, for example, something that I always repeat is that when you meet a client, it's fundamental. I mean, not all the time. It's fundamental to be in front of the person, physically, in presence. That's very important. Human being in front of another human being, first of all, as two pair. And everything we are telling about, I don't know, avoiding moral judgment about feelings and the value of narrative, for example, of the storytelling of the clients, all point very important. Yes. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Patrizia. I also think, in addition to, AI is not a moral being, AI doesn't suffer.
Yes,
so,
exactly. No feel emotion. Yes, I wrote about it. Yeah. No emotion, no creation, no intuition.
Well, it has it has no human agency at all.
Exactly. There is no human agency. There are data employed, lots of data, algorithm, fantastic algorithm, speed and memory. Of course, much more memory than our little human brain. And we lose memory in time, you see, when we get old. But as Bona said, of course, we are aging, but anyway, we are human. So we have emotion and the capacity to creation, intuition, just the way to feel and to be in empathy and in sympathy with people that, of course, AI doesn't have. It's a machine. It's a beautiful contemporary machine. And we as human beings invent machine. I mean, we are inventors, so that's good. It's our product, but must be controlled.
Would you want to talk to a therapist who doesn't even know what suffering is? I wouldn't.
Okay. Thank you, Patricia. We have to move on. We have limited
Let's
time.
move on.
2 more hands up. So thanks again for that reaffirmation. And Rick is next, and then Carolina. Please go ahead, Rick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great, because I'm out doing the peripatetic version of this part of the day. I need to get my exercise in, and I have my earphones in with the phone. So I apologize about the background moving and me being a little out of breath. But okay, I loved the talk. I loved all the major themes and major claims, although I have to take some issue with the presupposition that universal health care is necessarily a morally good system, and the opposite of that is a morally bankrupt system. So if I had that client that you used in your anecdote, I don't think I could do the personal share of my similar views because I have opposite views about that kind of case. So I hope I'm not committing the fallacy of attacking the illustration, because that was just to illustrate something about the connection about dignity and Levinas and all of that. I agree with all those things. But what would you suggest if I had your client and I have the opposite view about the healthcare, like her being entitled automatically to healthcare under whatever those circumstances were. And what came to mind when I was thinking about that was, how do we make that personal to us? Imagine if we were in some kind of system of philosophical counseling, would we automatically be required to take on clients who came in who didn't have the ability to pay us? It's just a way of trying to turn that around. I know I'm throwing a wrench here, but that's what I want to share. And one more thing about it. I have to recognize and have honor and dignity about my own autonomy, respect for my own dignity, my own views when I'm with a client. So this is a question. I'm curious what you have to say about this.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Rick. I love wrenches. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is you have to speak your truth from your perspective. So you couldn't, obviously, if you don't have my perspective, you can't take my perspective. You'd have to do a different kind of analysis. Maybe it would not be a systemic structural analysis.
Yeah. Let me interject. So it's not just I don't expect a whole big response from you, but one thing that I was thinking along that line is, one of the things you quoted from APA is about how we're not problem solvers, and we're supposed to also challenge our clients. That wasn't the exact wording, but we're supposed to be Socratic inquirers. So I was thinking, if that was my client, I would challenge the presupposition that you're entitled to immediate free healthcare. And I don't know if that would be, of course, I wouldn't do it in a way that seemed insensitive, but this is one of the things that I think philosophical counseling differs from psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, you want to be that supportive, hand-holding kind of person at times of need. But sometimes in philosophical counseling, the opposite is called for. And I think you yourself said that. So like I said, I might be just attacking the illustration here, and I don't need to do that.
Well, I mean, insurance isn't immediate free health care, for one thing. But the issue of whether or not people should have health care as a basic human right, as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, that's is a matter for contention. But from my perspective, I think they should, and that's why I felt angry, and also the way in which it was done.
Right.
Where the person was treated, they could be treated in a different way, rather than this, this labyrinth of unknowing that we have to go through to figure out if certain things are covered.
Okay.
Right.
Can we move on? Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, please. Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. You're very good on the move, I got to say, quite clear. Okay, Carolina, can you be brief, please?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Ross. I think you used the share aspect with your client just as a key to let her regenerate her dignity, because it's not about the health system. It's about a kind of thinking to feel the dignity again and go forward. That's what I can see from it. And the second point is a kind reaffirmation with you and Patricia that the AI, in fact, enhances our value, empowers our value, because it looks like a lot of data, a lot of knowledge, but not a human at all. This kind of humanity between two person. So just that's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Carolina. Yeah, if it were all about knowledge and data, then we'd be outstripped by AI. That's not the main function of us as counselors, I don't think. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Carolina. Vonna has her hand up. Vonna, we're supposed to end the session and take a break. Can we come back to you after the break to introduce our next speaker?
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yes, that's
okay. Thank you very much for that. I guess you're back with us, which is a very good thing. Ross, I just cannot resist concluding as moderator to make three quick comments to you very briefly. One, I was totally impressed by your pronunciation of all the French names, because very few of our compatriots can do that properly. So your French is excellent. I mean, that's partly jocular and partly serious. on a very serious side, I want to underscore to our counseling colleagues everything you said about circumscribed self-disclosure, because there's an art to that. And it's very easy for us to get propelled into the role of reversing the roles, which is a disaster, as you obviously know. So we don't need to go into details, just to affirm to somebody, oh, yes, I've been there, I've done that, I know from my own side what that experience is like. It gives a lot of therapeutic alliance, so without, again, reversing roles. And thirdly, I've lived in 4 different countries, 3 of which have socialized medicine, and it's failing. You can go to the UK where you're entitled to a free hip transplant, but you're going to wait 2 years. So they are practicing passive euthanasia because people who are not mobile will die of hypothermia and pneumonia in the winter because they have no central heating in miserable, damp climate. So they kill them off. Okay, you want to pay for it, you can get it immediately. Canada is going down the same road. It's a newer system. There's a very famous test case in Quebec of a disabled woman who needed a particular kind of wheelchair with some bells and whistles on it in order to be self-sufficient. 7-year waiting list. 7-year waiting list. The government offered her medically assisted suicide in 3 weeks. This is not compassion. You know this, Caroline. It's been in the news up there. So they will say, oh, we can't really give you a chair, but we could kill you right away if you want that option and put you out of your misery. I mean, this is worse than a dog. All right? We wouldn't do this to a dog. So I'm just saying that socialized medicine, it needs money to run like everything else. And if you take away the money and you put in a big bureaucracy, you end up hurting people, not helping them. That's just, one cheer for capitalism. Okay? Thank you very much, Ross. A really interesting and rich presentation. You raised a lot of important issues, and we're very grateful to you. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Lou, and everyone else. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, more than welcome. Okay, folks, we're going to take a very short break. 10 minutes, okay? We come back at 3 o'clock sharp. That's 10 minutes from now. And then, Vana, we'll turn things over to you, and we'll carry on with the program. Okay, we'll see you all shortly. Have a good break. Thanks again.